her true story from Ohio. My daughter mocked me at her wedding I paid for until the groom's boss took the microphone. You know that moment when your own daughter stands up at her wedding reception and decides to roast you in front of 200 guests? Well, that happened to me. But what happened next? The ballroom had gone silent when Natalie Davenport, radiant in her ivory gown, took the microphone. At first, Linda Davenport thought her daughter was about to give one of those sweet speeches brides are known for, something about family, love, and gratitude. Instead, Natalie's eyes twinkled with mischief as she leaned into the mic. "My mother," she began, pausing dramatically as her friends giggled in the corner. "Decided at 60 years old, mind you, that she was going to start a business. Can you believe that? A business at her age?" The crowd chuckled politely. Natalie grinned wider. "She calls it consulting and acquisitions, but honestly, I think it's just her way of keeping busy now that she's, well, you know." She made a theatrical gesture at Linda, wrinkling her nose. "Let's call it what it is, a late-life crisis with a fancy title." This time, the laughter was louder. A ripple went through the room. Even Adam Collins, Natalie's new husband, smirked beside her. His boss, Mr. Whitmore, chuckled into his champagne flute. Linda sat frozen at her table, her fingers tightening around her glass. Her face burned. Natalie wasn't finished. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love my mom, but when she told me she was going to run around buying companies, I almost fell out of my chair. Like, Mom, hello, retirement communities exist for a reason. Can someone get her a bingo card instead of a balance sheet? The laughter turned raucous. Guests leaned into each other, whispering, shaking their heads. Linda could see one of Natalie's bridesmaids wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Her stomach clenched. Her own daughter, her own flesh and blood. She had expected pride tonight, respect, at the very least kindness. Instead, she had become the evening's entertainment. She glanced at Adam. He wasn't stopping Natalie. He was encouraging her, his grin stretching wider the longer the crowd roared. And Mr. Whitmore, Adam's boss, laughed so hard he nearly choked on his drink. Linda pressed her napkin to her lap, willing herself not to cry. When the laughter finally ebbed, Natalie leaned down and kissed Linda on the cheek. "Don't worry, Mom. We all love you, even if you think you're some kind of corporate queen." The room erupted in applause, not for Linda, but for Natalie's performance. Linda forced a smile. She didn't trust her voice. Her mind was racing. They thought this was funny? That I was just a delusional old woman playing pretend with contracts and company names? None of them had the faintest idea what I had really been doing these past 2 years. She wanted to stand up and tell them, to shout that Davenport Enterprises wasn't a hobby. It was an empire, that she owned companies worth millions, that she had built something real, something powerful. But she stayed silent. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them show their true colors. Dinner resumed, music played, glasses clinked. But Linda barely tasted her food. Her mind replayed the laughter again and again. She smiled politely at those who glanced her way, but her heart ached. She thought of the nights she stayed up until dawn, poring over acquisition contracts, the meetings she'd flown to in secret, the sacrifices she'd made to grow her company from nothing but an idea scribbled in a notebook into a real force in the business world. All dismissed as a late-life crisis. And the cruelest cut of all, it hadn't come from strangers. It had come from her own daughter, the daughter she had raised single-handedly after her husband died. the daughter she had poured her soul into supporting. Linda excused herself quietly, slipping onto the balcony for air. The cool night breeze brushed her skin, soothing the fire burning in her chest. Inside, Natalie laughed with her friends, basking in the glow of her performance. Adam shook hands with Mr. Whitmore, already talking business, already building alliances. None of them knew that the very ground they stood on, Sterling Technologies, Adam's company, the source of his career, was now under Linda's control. 18 months earlier, through Davenport Enterprises, Linda had quietly acquired Sterling. Mr. Whitmore technically worked for her. Adam's paycheck came from her. The irony was almost too much to bear. They mocked her as a hobbyist, a silly old woman clinging to relevance. But the truth? She was their employer, their superior, their silent queen. And soon, very soon, that truth would come to light. That night, as Linda stood alone on the balcony, the laughter still echoing in her ears, she whispered to herself, "Laugh while you can, because when the truth comes out, none of you will ever laugh at me again." And here's where we leave her, standing in the shadows, holding on to a secret worth millions. If you've been hooked this far, don't just scroll away. Show Linda you believe in her. Hit that like button so her story gets heard. Subscribe so you're here when the shocking reveal explodes. The laughter from that night stayed with Linda Davenport long after the music faded and the champagne glasses were cleared. It wasn't just the humiliation that stung, it was the dismissal. To them, she wasn't a woman with vision or ambition. She was an aging mother clinging to relevance. But the truth was very different. 2 years earlier, when most women her age were considering retirement communities or long vacations, Linda had made a decision. She would not spend her remaining years fading quietly into the background. She wanted challenge, purpose, and the satisfaction of leaving a legacy far larger than the one people expected of her. So she founded Davenport Enterprises. It started modestly. She sold a parcel of land she had inherited from her late husband and used the proceeds to fund her first acquisition, a small but struggling logistics company. People scoffed. Friends told her it was a mistake, but Linda saw potential where others saw failure. She modernized the company's operations, brought in a young, energetic management team, and within a year it was profitable again. That was only the beginning. Linda learned quickly that the key to success wasn't noise, but silence. While others boasted about their plans, she worked quietly, making connections, studying market reports, and attending conferences where she was often the oldest person in the room. People underestimated her constantly, and she discovered that was her greatest advantage. In less than 2 years, she acquired 6 companies across logistics, tech, and consulting. She didn't flaunt her success. She didn't plaster her face on magazine covers. She preferred working in the shadows, where no one realized how much ground she was covering. But her influence was spreading. Her name began to circulate in boardrooms, whispered with equal parts curiosity and respect. To the outside world, she was just Linda Davenport, a widow with too much time on her hands. In reality, she was becoming a force to be reckoned with. The defining moment came when she quietly purchased Sterling Technologies, the very company where her future son-in-law, Adam Collins, worked. The deal had been complicated, requiring months of negotiations and multiple shell entities to keep her involvement discreet. By the time it was finalized, Adam had no idea who really signed his paycheck. Linda remembered the day the papers were signed. She sat in her office, a modest but elegant space with tall shelves lined with business books and family photos, as her lawyer slid the final contract across the desk. "Congratulations, Mrs. Davenport," he said. "You now own Sterling Technologies." She didn't smile, not outwardly at least. Inside, though, she felt a surge of satisfaction. She had not only acquired a company, she had acquired the ground on which her daughter's new husband stood. The rise had not been without cost. Linda often worked 18-hour days. She missed dinners with friends. She turned down vacations.
There were nights she sat alone in her office, staring at spreadsheets until her eyes blurred. But every sacrifice was worth it. For the first time since her husband's passing, she felt alive. Every deal she closed, every company she saved from collapse, added to a legacy that was hers alone. Sometimes, though, in the quiet hours, she wondered if Natalie would ever understand. Her daughter had grown up seeing her as nothing more than Mom, the dependable figure who cooked, cleaned, and kept the world steady. Natalie didn't know this version of her, the woman who commanded boardrooms and signed million-dollar deals. Linda hoped that one day she would. As Linda sat through Natalie's wedding reception, enduring the laughter of strangers at her expense, she thought of those long nights in her office. She thought of the battle she had fought and won in silence. She thought of Sterling Technologies, Adam's company, sitting firmly in her portfolio. The irony was sharp. They mocked her ambition as a late-life crisis, never realizing that the very man Natalie had chosen to marry relied on her company for his livelihood. Linda remained silent at the wedding, but her mind was steady. She did not need to lash out or correct them. The truth had a way of rising, and when it did, it would not need her defense. For now she carried her secret like a crown no one could see. The question is, when the truth comes crashing into that ballroom, will Natalie still dare to laugh? The night wore on, the band playing soft jazz while waiters carried trays of champagne flutes through the crowded hall. The sting of Natalie's cruel roast still lingered in Linda Davenport's chest, but she held her head high. Years of business negotiations had taught her how to keep her face unreadable even when her heart was bruised. She watched as Adam Collins moved confidently through the room, shaking hands with guests, exchanging jokes with his colleagues. He seemed proud to stand at Natalie's side, basking in the glow of being a newlywed and a man on the rise. Among the guests, Mr. Whitmore, Adam's boss at Sterling Technologies, stood with a small group near the bar. A tall man with silver hair and an authoritative presence, he laughed easily as he retold stories from the office. Every so often his eyes drifted across the room, and I noticed the way he seemed to study me. At first I thought nothing of it. Perhaps he was simply curious about the bride's mother. But when he excused himself from the group and walked directly towards me, Linda felt a shift in the air. "Mrs. Davenport, isn't it?" Mr. Whitmore said warmly, extending his hand. "Yes," Linda replied, shaking it with practiced composure. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so others couldn't overhear. "I thought I recognized you. You attended the Global Acquisition Summit in Chicago last year, didn't you? Davenport. Enterprises." Linda's heart skipped, but her face remained calm. Few in the room even knew her company existed, let alone connected her face to it. "Yes," she admitted softly. Mr. Whitmore's eyebrows lifted. "Well, that explains it. I knew I wasn't mistaken. Quite the reputation you've built for yourself in such a short time."
Linda offered a polite smile. "Thank you." But before she could steer the conversation elsewhere, Natalie and Adam approached, curious about what they were missing. "What are you two whispering about?" Natalie asked playfully, slipping her arm through Adam's. Mr. Whitmore straightened, his voice carrying easily across the table. "I was just congratulating your mother. She's been making waves in the acquisitions world. You didn't tell me, Adam, that you'd married into the Davenport family?" Adam frowned slightly, confused. "What do you mean?" Mr. Whitmore chuckled. "Your wife's mother owns Davenport Enterprises. Ring any bells? She's the one who signed the acquisition papers for Sterling Technologies last year." The words seemed to hang in the air, louder than the band, louder than the chatter of guests. Conversations nearby faltered. Heads turned. Adam blinked, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Natalie's face flushed crimson. "That's not possible," Natalie stammered. "My mom doesn't... She trailed off, suddenly unsure of her own words. Mr. Whitmore looked at her with genuine surprise. "You mean you didn't know? Davenport Enterprises is one of the most aggressive acquisition firms on the East Coast. Without your mother, Sterling wouldn't even be standing right now." The table fell silent.
Guests who had overheard the exchange were whispering now, passing the revelation down the line like wildfire. Within minutes, the entire room seemed to know. The woman they had mocked as a bored, aging mother was in fact the very force behind companies worth millions, including the one that employed the groom. Adam's face turned pale as he slowly looked at Linda, as if seeing her for the first time. Natalie's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes darting nervously between her husband, her mother, and the guests who now stared openly. Linda said nothing. She simply lifted her glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down again. What is he talking about?" Natalie finally whispered, her voice cracking. Linda's gaze was steady as she looked at her daughter. "What he said is true. Davenport Enterprises is mine. Every late night, every meeting, every so-called hobby you mocked, I was building something real, something far larger than you imagined." Adam swallowed hard, his polished exterior faltering. "You own Sterling?" "Yes, I own Sterling. Which means, Adam, that every paycheck you've ever received these past months has come through me." A ripple of gasps spread through the tables nearby. Some guests covered their mouths in shock. Others exchanged knowing glances, as if suddenly embarrassed for having laughed at her earlier. Natalie's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no defense came. From that moment, the reception changed. Conversations shifted. Guests who had previously dismissed Linda as irrelevant now approached her with newfound respect, asking polite questions, offering compliments they hadn't considered giving before. Mr. Whitmore remained close by, clearly impressed. "I'll admit," he said with a chuckle, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight, but this explains a lot. The quiet ones are always the sharpest players." Linda nodded politely, though inside her emotions swirled. This was not the way she had wanted the truth to come out, not as a spectacle at her daughter's wedding, not as a public correction of cruel mockery, but fate had chosen this stage, and she would not shrink from it. For Natalie and Adam, however, the glow of their celebration had dimmed. Natalie avoided her mother's eyes for the rest of the night, her earlier confidence shattered. Adam kept his distance, lost in thought, realizing he had mocked and underestimated the very woman who held power over his professional future. As the evening wound down, Linda slipped back onto the balcony, this time not to escape, but to breathe in the cool night air with a sense of quiet vindication. She had not spoken loudly, nor had she demanded recognition. The truth had surfaced on its own, as it always did. She thought of the laughter that had burned her hours earlier and how quickly it had turned to silence once the truth was revealed. Not all wounds heal in a single evening, but for the first time in a long while, Linda felt seen. The empire she had built in secret was no longer invisible, and the daughter who had mocked her would now have to face the reality of who she truly was. The ballroom was no longer filled with carefree laughter. Instead, the atmosphere had shifted to something taut, brittle, as though everyone was walking on fragile glass. What had begun as a wedding reception full of joy now hummed with tension and whispered speculation. Natalie Davenport sat stiffly at the head table, her once flushed cheeks pale under the bright lights. The same friends who had doubled over laughing during her roast of her mother now avoided her gaze. The shift was palpable. The audience of her cruel comedy had evaporated. Adam Collins was worse off. He sat hunched forward, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, eyes darting anywhere but toward Linda Davenport. His confidence, his endless bravado, had vanished in the shadow of the revelation. Every passing moment seemed to remind him that the very foundation of his career rested in the hands of the woman who he had so easily dismissed. Mr. Whitmore, who had unintentionally sparked the unraveling, excused himself quietly from the group and returned to the bar, sipping champagne with the satisfied air of a man who had simply spoken the truth. Adam Collins was worse off. He sat hunched forward, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, eyes darting anywhere but toward Linda Davenport. His confidence, his endless bravado had vanished in the shadow of the revelation.
every passing moment seemed to remind him that the very foundation of his career rested in the hands of the woman he had so easily dismissed. Mr. Whitmore, who had unwittingly sparked the unraveling, excused himself quietly from the group and returned to the bar, sipping champagne with the satisfied air of a man who had simply spoken the truth. Natalie finally broke the unbearable silence at the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was small, trembling, not with anger, but with a child's desperate confusion. Linda looked at her daughter, her expression calm but unreadable. "Would you have listened if I had?" The question lingered between them like smoke. Natalie opened her mouth, then closed it again. Deep down, she knew the answer. She had never taken her mother seriously, not her ideas, not her ambitions, not her new ventures. She had written them all off as distractions, nothing more. Now, the reality stung. Her mother wasn't chasing a hobby. She had been building an empire while Natalie looked the other way. Natalie faltered. "I didn't think you could actually—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Do you hear yourself?" Linda asked softly, her voice steady. "You didn't think I could. That is the heart of it, isn't it? You've always assumed age meant weakness, that my wrinkles erased my mind, that motherhood erased my ambition." Natalie lowered her gaze, shame pressing down like lead. Across the table, Adam tried to salvage some dignity. "Mrs. Davenport," he said carefully, "I had no idea. If I'd known—" Linda's eyes cut to him, sharp as glass. "If you'd known what? That you might treat me with respect? That you might think twice before laughing at me with your friends?" Adam's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had faced plenty of adversaries in boardrooms, but none had ever left him so utterly exposed. The woman he had underestimated controlled the company that paid his salary. She had the power to change the course of his career with a single decision. For the first time in years, Adam felt small. Around the room, guests murmured in hushed tones. The story had already spread from table to table, whispered with growing exaggeration. "That's her? She owns Sterling Technologies? I heard her portfolio is worth over $50 million. They laughed at her? Can you believe it?" Some guests who had joined in Natalie's mockery earlier now approached Linda with nervous smiles, eager to erase their complicity with polite conversation. Others simply avoided her altogether, ashamed to meet her eyes. But Linda didn't need their validation. She had lived without it for years. Later in the evening, after the cake was cut and the music had resumed, Linda found Natalie alone in the bridal suite, hunched on the sofa with her wedding dress pooling around her like waves. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to humiliate you. I thought it was funny." "Funny," Linda repeated gently, though her tone carried the weight of all the years she had been underestimated. "Natalie, I raised you to be strong, to be thoughtful, to know your worth. And yet you stood in front of hundreds of people and reduced me to a punchline." Tears spilled down Natalie's cheeks. "I was wrong." Linda knelt in front of her daughter, her hands steady on her trembling ones. "You weren't just wrong. You were cruel, but more than that, you were blind. You chose not to see me, not as a woman, not as a leader, not even as your mother." Natalie choked on a sob, her pride crumbling in the face of truth. For the first time that night, she truly looked at her mother, not as the wrinkled woman she had dismissed, but as the architect of something powerful, something undeniable. Linda stood, her back straight, her voice calm. "I don't need your approval, Natalie. I never did. But I did hope for your respect. And perhaps one day you'll learn that respect must be given before it can be received." She left the room then, her footsteps firm against the marble floors, her head held high. She did not look back. Natalie sat frozen in place, her sobs quiet but steady.
For the first time in her life, she felt the sharp sting of regret, not for words spoken in haste, but for years of assumptions, for a lifetime of overlooking the woman who had given her everything. Downstairs, the music played on. Guests danced and laughed, but now with an undercurrent of restraint. Linda mingled with a few who approached respectfully, answering their polite questions with a composed smile. She wasn't interested in their approval either. Her satisfaction came not from their sudden awe, but from her own truth. She had endured the mockery. She had carried her secret in silence, and when the truth had risen, it had spoken louder than she ever could. Linda Davenport had been underestimated her entire life, but not anymore. And if you're still here listening to Linda's story unfold, it says something about you. You're not like the guests who laughed, or even like Natalie who refused to see her mother clearly. You're still watching, still listening, because you know there's more beneath the surface of every story, every scar, every wrinkle. You've stayed when others would have walked away, and that makes you the real hero here. What does justice look like when the scars of betrayal run deeper than the applause of vindication?
The wedding reception ended hours later, but for Linda Davenport, the echoes of laughter, gasps, and whispers still lingered like a storm cloud in her chest. The guests had left with stories they would retell for years, about the mother mocked and the secret empire revealed. Yet for Linda, it wasn't about gossip or spectacle. It was about the shift that had finally, undeniably taken place. For the first time, people had seen her clearly. The morning light streamed through her curtains as Linda sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling between her hands. She had barely slept. Her mind replayed every moment. Natalie's cruel joke, the ripple of laughter, the stunned silence after Mr. Whitmore's revelation. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Messages poured in from guests, colleagues, even distant acquaintances who had suddenly discovered her identity. Most were full of apologies, awkward compliments, or desperate attempts to rebuild bridges they hadn't realized they'd burned. Linda ignored them. She didn't need their approval. Stay with me now. Her focus was on the two people who mattered most in the fallout, Natalie and Adam. 2 days later, Natalie appeared at her mother's door. She looked nothing like the glowing bride from the reception. Her eyes were swollen, her shoulders hunched. "Mom," she whispered when Linda opened the door, "can we talk?" Linda studied her daughter for a long moment before stepping aside. Natalie sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Linda had spent countless mornings helping her with homework, sewing her school uniforms, listening to her teenage heartbreaks. Now the table felt like a courtroom. "I was horrible to you," Natalie began, her voice trembling. "I made fun of you in front of everyone I know. I thought I was being clever, funny, but I was cruel, and I didn't even know who you really were." Linda's expression softened slightly, though her tone was steady. "Natalie, the worst part wasn't that you didn't know. It was that you didn't care to ask. You decided who I was before you ever gave me a chance to show you." Tears streamed down Natalie's face. "I don't know how to fix this." Linda reached across the table, placing her hand gently over her daughter's. "You don't fix it with words. You fix it with time, with humility, with listening instead of assuming." Natalie nodded, her sobs quiet. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Adam, however, was a different matter. When he requested a meeting with Linda a week later, she agreed, curious to see what he would say. He arrived in his crisp business suit, though his confidence had dulled. "Mrs. Davenport," he began, "I owe you an apology." Linda said nothing, waiting. "I never should have laughed at you. I didn't understand who you were, and I certainly didn't respect it. That was my mistake. I hope this doesn't affect my standing at Sterling." Linda's gaze was sharp. "That's what worries you? Your standing?" Adam shifted uncomfortably. Well, yes, my career is important." "Your career?"
Linda said firmly, rests on more than job titles and salaries. It rests on character. You mock the very person who signs your checks. You treated me as irrelevant because of my age. Tell me, Adam, what does that say about the kind of man you are? He flushed, unable to answer. Linda leaned forward. This isn't about me. It's about you. Until you learn to respect people without knowing what power they hold, you'll always be a man chasing shadows instead of building something real.
Adam left humbled, his carefully polished exterior cracked. Whether he would learn remained to be seen. In the months that followed, Davenport Enterprises grew stronger. Linda's portfolio expanded into new industries, from healthcare to sustainable energy. Articles began to appear in business journals, hailing her as a visionary who had defied the limits of age to build a multi-million-dollar empire. But Linda never lost her humility. She didn't crave magazine covers or red carpet galas. What mattered was the work itself, the deals that saved jobs, the companies she revitalized, the quiet legacy she built each day. Her office walls bore not awards, but photographs. Her late husband smiling on their wedding day. Natalie as a child clutching her hand. The first tiny warehouse she had acquired when no one believed in her vision. She didn't need the world's applause. She carried her legacy in silence, just as she had built it. Over time, Natalie began to heal the fractured bond with her mother. She attended therapy sessions with Linda where uncomfortable truths were spoken and painful memories revisited. It wasn't easy. Natalie carried deep guilt for mocking the woman who had raised her. But Linda, though hurt, chose not to let bitterness harden her heart. I cannot change what you did, she told her daughter, but I can teach you to see me, not just as your mother, but as a woman in my own right. Slowly, Natalie learned. She began asking questions about the business, eager to understand the empire her mother had built. She sat in on meetings, shadowed Linda in negotiations, and for the first time, truly listened. Linda didn't know if Natalie would ever fully understand the weight of her betrayal, but she saw growth, and growth she knew was more valuable than perfection. By the time Linda turned 62, Davenport Enterprises was valued at over $50 million. She had become a respected figure in the business world, admired for her resilience and vision. Yet the memory of that wedding night stayed with her, not as a scar, but as a reminder. A reminder that people will always underestimate what they do not understand. That strength isn't measured in the smoothness of skin or the approval of others, but in the courage to keep building when no one believes you can. And perhaps most of all, a reminder that even those closest to us can fail to see our worth until the truth demands to be seen. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city skyline, Natalie beside her, Linda finally felt peace. "Mom," Natalie whispered, her voice soft but steady, "you're the strongest woman I know." Linda smiled faintly, her eyes on the glowing lights of the city she had quietly conquered. Strength isn't about power, Natalie. It's about persistence, about refusing to be erased. The city buzzed with life below them, unaware of the quiet empire built by the woman on the balcony. But Linda didn't need recognition. She had already won. Her legacy was secure, not in the headlines, but in the lives she had touched, the companies she had saved, and the lesson she had lived. Never underestimate a woman who refuses to disappear. And if you've walked with Linda this far, if you've seen the laughter turn to silence, the scars turn to strength, then you know stories like this matter. So do her a favor, and yourself one too. Hit that like button if you believe her fight deserves to be remembered. Subscribe so you never miss stories that reveal the truth behind the scars.